Good evening and welcome to Scotland at 7. I'm Scott Bevan coming to you here live from Glasgow. We are joined today by Dr Philippa Whitford MP, the SNP spokesperson on Brexit, and I'll be interviewing Philippa after the news headlines. First then with the coronavirus update. As of 2 p.m. today, a total of 2,199,742 people in Scotland have been tested through NHS Scotland labs and UK Government regional testing centres since the start of the pandemic. Of these, 1,934,285 have been confirmed negative. 265,457 have tested positive. There are 1,747 new cases of COVID-19 confirmed by a test, although not everyone with the virus will display symptoms and not all those with symptoms will be tested. There are 2 new reported deaths of people who have tested positive. The number of patients in Scotland who have died from complications caused by the coronavirus COVID-19 infection now stands at 7,708. This number only includes those who have died having received a positive test for the virus in the previous 28 days. Of the people who have tested positive, 188 were in hospital last night, 16 of whom were in intensive care. As of 8 a.m. this morning, 3,709,801 people had received their first dose of the COVID-19 vaccination, and 2,647,397 had received their second dose. The latest UK daily figures showed 128,066 patients who tested positive for COVID-19 have sadly died from their illness, an increase of 18 since yesterday. This number refers to deaths in all settings and not just those in hospitals. Serious questions have been raised over whether Matt Hancock has broken the ministerial code. There have been claims that Tory Health Secretary Matt Hancock has serious questions to answer over his alleged breach of the ministerial code following recent revelations. It comes after questions emerged over how a director of a lobbying firm, who was also a university friend of the Health Secretary, was given a series of roles at the heart of Whitehall, including a £15,000 role on the board of his department. The ministerial code sets out, on appointment to each new office, ministers must provide their permanent secretary with a full list in writing of all interests which might be thought to give rise to a conflict. The list should also cover interests of the minister's spouse or partner and close family which might be thought to give rise to a conflict. Despite the mounting pressure and questions, the Prime Minister's official spokesperson said that Boris Johnson had accepted Matt Hancock's reasoning. Commenting, the SNP's Westminster Deputy Leader, Kirsten Oswald, said, "The stench of cronyism and sleaze surrounding this Tory government grows stronger with each day that passes. Despite the Prime Minister and Health Secretary's best attempts to brush this entire episode under the already stuffed carpet, the reality is that there are very serious questions for Matt Hancock to answer over whether or not he has broken the ministerial code." The UK is facing a summer of food shortages due to the lack of lorry drivers. The UK is facing a summer of food shortages likened to a series of rolling power cuts because of a loss of 100,000 lorry drivers due to the impact of Brexit, and to a lesser degree, COVID. Industry chiefs have warned, and in a letter to Boris Johnson they have called for an urgent intervention to allow Eastern European drivers back into the country on special visas, similar to those issued to farm pickers, warning that there is a crisis in the supply chain. They have said shortages of workers in warehouse and food processing centres are also having an impact with packing food for supermarket shelves. Tesco bosses raised the issue at a meeting with the Transport Minister, Lady Vere, last week, warning that the vacancies were creating 48 tonnes of food waste each week, the equivalent of 2 truckloads. Sources at the supermarket chain said the lorry driver shortage was affecting fresh food with short shelf life. The Guardian has reported that one Polish driver who had lived in the country before Brexit, who arrived in Doncaster, Sheffield Airport, to report to the crisis, but was refused entry by Border Force because he did not have enough evidence at the airport to support his settled status claim. There is an enormous shortage of HGV drivers that we estimate at between 85,000 and 100,000, said Richard Burnett, Chief Executive of the Road Haulage Association. DOJ files a lawsuit to challenge Georgia's sweeping voting restrictions. The US Justice Department is filing a major federal lawsuit challenging a new sweeping voting measure in Georgia that is widely seen as a blatant effort to make it harder for minorities to vote in the state. The challenge is the first major voting rights case filed under the Biden administration and marks one of just a handful of suits the department has filed in recent years challenging voting laws on a statewide basis. At a press conference today, Attorney General Merrick Garland said the complaint alleges that recent changes to Georgia's election laws were enacted with the purpose of denying or abridging the right of black Georgians to vote on account of their race or colour, in violation of Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. The move comes amid a wave of state laws passed by Republican-run legislators across the US that are seen as attempts to suppress the vote of Democratic-leaning communities of colour. It also comes after Republicans in the US Senate effectively torpedoed Democrat attempts to pass a new law defending voting rights. Garland announced the suit on the 8th anniversary of the Supreme Court's decision in Shelby County v. Holder, a case that gutted a critical provision in the Voting Rights Act and enabled states like Georgia to pass voting restrictions with much less federal oversight. If that provision was still in effect, the Georgia law would probably not have been enacted, Garland said on Friday. There has been a consultation on licensing order for short-term lets. Consultations on the details of a licensing scheme for short-term lets will take place over 7 weeks this summer. Social Justice Secretary Shona Robinson has announced the publication of a draft licensing order for consultation ahead of laying the final legislation at the Scottish Parliament in September. Stakeholders will now have until the 13th of August to comment on the licensing order and the draft business and regulatory impact assessment. Draft guidance documents have also been published to explain how the legislation would work in practice. Ms Robinson said, "The regulation of short-term lets is vital if we are to balance the needs and concerns of our communities with wider economic and tourism interests. Short-term lets can offer people a flexible and cheaper travel option and have contributed positively to our tourism industry and local economies across the country. However, we know that in certain areas, particularly tourist hotspots, high numbers of short-term lets can cause problems for neighbours and make it harder for people to find homes to live in." A poll has suggested that 80% of Scots think that the Brexit process is not yet done. Polling by YouGov suggests 80% of Scots think the Brexit process is not done, the highest of any part of Great Britain polled, with 72% across Britain believing the Brexit process is not done. Additional Brexit anniversary polling by YouGov suggests 47% of people in Scotland think that the UK is economically worse off because of Brexit, 43% for Great Britain, and 50% believe the UK has less influence in the world as a result of Brexit, 39% across Britain. Commenting, Michael Russell, political director of the SNP's Independence Unit, said, "Yet again, polls point to how damaging Brexit is, both for the economy and the UK's international reputation. It also underlines how the 2014 promise by the anti-independence campaign that voting no meant staying in the EU was just plain wrong." Scotland did not vote for Brexit, and as the Scottish Government's new Brexit analysis of yesterday shows, it is now having to endure an ever-lengthening catalogue of economic damage against its wishes. That's our news headlines for this evening. We are joined now by Dr Philippa Whitford. Hello, Philippa. Hi.
Hi there. How are you doing?
Hi there. Yes, not too bad. So we are seeing more and more the impact that Brexit is having on the people of Scotland and indeed the people of the whole of the UK. Taking us back 5 years then, because this is, the anniversary of the vote, and taking us back to that vote, Did you see the situation where, England would vote to leave and Scotland would vote to remain? When was it that you thought that that may be the case and, the impact that that was going to have?
Well, I think I certainly always felt that Scotland would vote more clearly for the EU than England would. The kind of whole Brexit narrative, the Brexit campaign was very English based. It didn't have a strong majority support up here. Indeed, there were many people who kind of slightly thought, well, that's their referendum. We're not interested in this. We
Mm,
want to stay in the EU. And this was a possibility that England would vote out. But to be honest, I think overall people still thought the majority would be for Remain. So, I remember the shock. I was at the count in Ayr, kind of in the wee small hours, watching some of the cities in the northeast of England, particularly places like Sunderland, that actually gained a lot from being in the EU, vote to leave. And I thought, right, okay, this is starting to look dangerous.
mm. I remember, well, I was in Paris at the time during the Euros, the last Euros, just before the vote. We came back just in time for the vote. And I was there when Joe Cox was murdered and watched that on television. I couldn't envisage after that we would vote to leave. I did think that England there would be far stronger support for it than there was in Scotland. But even on the French news, then they were talking about how Scotland did not support this idea of Brexit even before the vote, and that was in France. So Europe,
Yeah, no, I think it was. I think it was clear that the narrative in Scotland was pro EU,
mm,
and within the Scottish Parliament there weren't really many MSPs campaigning for Brexit, so there wasn't really a big campaign base in Scotland pro Brexit. It was very much coming over the border on media, etc., which is of course UK wide, but there wasn't that strong pro Brexit voice within Scotland. I have to say, I mean, I remember because obviously we come up from Westminster on a Thursday. And driving home from the airport and hearing on the radio the news about Joe Cox and being obviously utterly shocked, but also thinking that the kind of xenophobia, the racism that had been involved with the gentleman who murdered her would kind of make people pause and think, wait a minute,
yeah.
what is going on here? Is this really what we want to be doing? Is this the kind of thinking, this anti-foreigner thinking that we want to be encouraging? And unfortunately, the vote even in that area was still very much pro-Brexit.
Mm. Was there ever a situation, do you think, where a Labour-led Brexit under a Jeremy Corbyn government, for example, might have not been as bad and might have garnered the support of people across the UK and across Scotland? Do you think that that would have been better if Labour had been in charge of that process?
Well, I'm not sure. I mean, Jeremy Corbyn was a lifelong Brexiteer, and that's part of what really led to the
Mm,
Labour Party at Westminster just constantly sitting on the fence throughout the kind of 3 years, if you like, 3.5 years up to the end of 2019, and not really able to come up with a policy on Brexit, and trying to keep their London supporters and their North of England supporters happy. So I'm not sure how different it would have been. I mean, Theresa May said at the start, I will consult across the UK, I will consult across the House of Commons, and we will agree a form of Brexit before I go to Europe. And she didn't do that at all. And then in her Lancaster House speech, when she came out with her kind of key points, it was already, we're leaving the single market, we're leaving the customs union. It was already kind of anti-EU citizen. So, a lot of it was already cast by Theresa May. And, we look back and think, well, okay, what we ended up with was more extreme. But she was already getting herself tied in knots even at that time. And she didn't bother consulting with the devolved governments. She didn't bother consulting with the other parties in Parliament. And of course, at that time, in December 16, was when the Scottish government were the first to actually put pen to paper and come up with a compromise, Scotland's place in Europe, which was that both Scotland and Northern Ireland should stay in the single market and either in or close to the customs union, respecting how both of those nations had voted. That was thrown out literally a couple of months later with no real respect for it. And obviously Scotland's had nothing out of this. We've not been listened to, we've not been respected. There's been utterly no compromise to the fact that 62% of Scottish voters voted to stay in the EU and still would.
Yeah. Do you think that was then one of the big stumbling blocks at the time, was the fact that Jeremy Corbyn, for all his potential positives, was essentially a Brexiteer and therefore not willing to put up too much of a fight? Do you think that that was what hampered the movement to stop Brexit from happening?
Oh, I think that definitely hampered it. I was part of what started as quite a small cross-party group around a thing we called the Doctors' Amendment, with two Conservative doctors, myself and a doctor from Labour, saying that, if you were offering someone an operation, it would be based on informed consent. And what we
Mm.
see when we look back was the absolute paucity of the debate before the vote. It was very short. It didn't explore a lot of detail. And the UK government, David Cameron and George Osborne at the time, just used Project Fear, instead of talking about some of the really good things that we gain as individuals from being in the EU. So they used the same approach they'd used in the Scottish referendum, thinking that that would work, and it didn't. And obviously on the other side, we had, the lies written on the side of a bus. We had Boris Johnson and Michael Gove saying absolutely nothing will change for EU citizens. And, with a German husband, I can tell you that's absolutely not the case. So,
Mm.
we had a lot of lies and a lot of kind of fear before it, instead of actually looking at what's good about Europe. And the problem is, it was based on 40 years of negative media and negative politics. So people like Boris Johnson, and his straight banana stories and so on, but also politicians. The EU had been a handy whipping boy to always say, oh, I would fix
Yeah.
this problem, but the EU won't let me. So, it didn't just come out of nowhere. It was based on decades of never valuing what we'd gained from the EU and always kind of portraying something negative. But during that kind of cross-party period, when we were, having Brexit votes all the time, and, the margin in it was one or two, the kind of disarray on the Labour benches was obvious. There were different points at which, if Labour had moved clearly in behind the idea of a second vote, a people's vote, etc., we could have brought that to fruition. But they never did. They were always on the fence at the wrong time. And, as you say, I think that was because underlying it, Corbyn wanted there to be Brexit, but wanted the Tories to have the blame for it.
Yeah. You touched on there the mainstream media not reporting properly on Brexit, on Europe for many, many years. Do you think that that's part of the problem, is that it hasn't been reported, Europe in general has not been reported thoroughly or accurately in the mainstream press for a number of years? And is this something that post-independence perhaps the media in Scotland should be really focusing on?
Well, I think, it's not a matter just of focusing, but, particularly broadcast media is meant to be impartial and is meant to be balanced. But we have reached a point where even when presenting a piece of news, there is a lot of using of such and such is accused of, someone else claims that, and
Mm.
yet that makes it sound like they are reporting something that genuinely happened. And,
Yeah.
we experience that in Scotland all the time, in our broadcast media. And, the thing is, we had the same kind of thing about Europe, that so and so claims that, Europe is just keen on a butter mountain, or is going to, burn our orchards or change the shape of our fruit, or not going to let us do this, that, and the other. And, Boris Johnson later admitted that some of his stories were, frankly, just made up. But they had all fed into a narrative of the EU as being separate to us and making us do things that we didn't want. Whereas in actual fact, the UK was a major player within the EU. The UK was one of the major contributors to developing the single market. There's lots of things where, if you follow it back, you find the UK campaigning and pushing for certain things, including under Tony Blair, pushing for the Eastern extension, the accelerated admission of Eastern European countries, allowing people to come more quickly to settle in the UK than, say, Germany did, and then suddenly, reversing that and going back down the hill and go, Europe made us do that, when actually it wasn't true. And of course, the anti-immigration thread within it was huge. And yet the public now have begun to realize, the shortages of key staff in so many sectors, that a lot of that kind of anti-immigration within the general public has cooled way back.
Yeah. Boris Johnson, of course, didn't always claim to support Brexit. In fact, many years ago he was outspokenly for the EU and then completely turned around, and was one of the instigators of the Brexit campaign, talking about 350 million for the NHS and his big Independence Day speech and all the rest of it. Was this all, do you think, simply to get him into power?
Oh, absolutely. I absolutely think that. I mean, that we are told that he had sort of two versions of the article that he wrote when he said he was going to support Brexit and be part of the campaign. That he was literally still trying to decide at the last minute which way he was going to jump. I certainly don't think he had a deep belief in Brexit. I think he thought they wouldn't win, but it would damage David Cameron enough that he had to give way, and therefore Boris Johnson would start to be in probably a straight runoff with George Osborne to be the next leader of the Conservative Party. So I absolutely think it's all been about Boris Johnson. And if we look at the decisions that the UK government still make now, I mean, including not putting India on the red list because Boris Johnson wanted to go on a trade visit and have a photo opportunity in India. And now look at us, we've got surging COVID cases, across the UK at the moment, which was totally unnecessary.
Yeah. Cameron and Johnson grew up together, didn't they? They were in the Bullingdon Club and all that together. And do you think that a lot of it is personal for him? So this was a case of him sort of getting back at him, perhaps, for things that had happened in the past when they were young.
Okay, I have no idea of that. I mean, obviously they moved in the same kind of circles in, Eton and university and all the rest of it. But whether they were friends or enemies at that time, I have absolutely no idea. But I have utterly no respect for Boris Johnson. It's not that he's a political opponent that I disagree with, but I recognize, he believes that, I believe this. He, to me, is a complete charlatan and is purely interested
Yeah.
in his own interest. And I think we see that emerging in the current UK government, in the cronyism, in the handing out contracts to donors and pals and even family members, and that all of that is considered and treated as if it's okay, because the person at the top, the Prime Minister, has done, has done similar things.
Yeah, these things that you mention, the cronyism and everything that they are doing in Northern Ireland and what they're doing with their authoritarian measures that they're bringing in to try and stop protests and ban books and all the rest of it. Are these things happening as a result of Brexit? Do you think that they would have felt bold enough to get away with all this had it not been for Brexit?
I'm not sure they would have felt bold enough. I don't think Brexit caused them. I think that Brexit, as you say, kind of gave them permission to go in that direction. It showed them the sort of support they could count on. I mean, we look with kind of utterly bemused that they still are ahead in the polls when you look at the incompetence and the corruption and the kind of things that in the past ministers would have resigned over. And now it's kind of, no comment and on they go. And that's quite shocking. And it undermines any sense of trust in any politics. And that then becomes dangerous for other parliaments, other governments, when there's just this tarring all politicians with that same brush. But to me, Boris Johnson's always been about Boris Johnson, and he still is.
Yeah. What should have been done then, do you think, 3, 4 years ago in order to either stop Brexit or to have a sort of light Brexit, as it was described then, that wouldn't perhaps be quite as harsh and harmful as the hard Brexit appears to be playing out? Do you think that there's more that could have been done by the Scottish Government or by Labour or by anyone 3 or 4 years ago that would have made a big difference to where we are now?
Well, I think the Scottish government tried. I mean, they put forward two editions of Scotland's place in Europe in December 16, and then again the following year with a bit more flesh on the bones, and it was just dismissed. So I think the blame, while yes, Labour could have had their act together, and maybe we could have opposed it better, but the blame lies with the Conservatives and initially with Theresa May. She simply was not willing to look at, well, okay, what on earth does Brexit mean? Because it was not well defined, and actually quite a lot of the, key proponents of Brexit were saying things like, of course we won't leave the single market. Well, that's the one thing you could have looked to do that would made a big difference to where we are now. There was a lot of talk about, oh, what we object to is the political union. We're not against the economic union. So, you could have had discussions about more a position like the kind of EFTA countries. Now, they may not have welcomed having a bull in a china shop of the UK joining their small group of small countries and throwing their weight around, but they could have looked for something closer to that. Closer within the single market and with alignment. I mean, the biggest disruption at the moment is around the sanitary and phytosanitary checks on things like fishing, fish, seafood, animals, vegetables, all the rest of it. Anything that is agri-foods or fisheries is struggling to get across the border.
Yeah.
And so, the EU had offered a veterinary agreement. They've offered another veterinary agreement. It's the UK that's refusing these things. I mean, the EU has even offered a temporary veterinary agreement for a number of years to allow other options to be looked at, to get rid of all the friction that is both between the UK-EU border and, of course, the border to Northern Ireland, which, I'm from originally, so I'm well aware of the impact of the Northern Ireland Protocol.
Yeah. What do you think the future is currently then for Northern Ireland? Of course, if they are going to be out with the EU, this is going to cause a lot of problems on the Irish border, isn't it? And we've already seen that happen. Plenty of people talking about how this could be a return to the Troubles and everything else. Do you think it's going to go as far as that?
I hope to goodness it isn't. I mean, there isn't a family in Northern Ireland that wasn't affected in some way by the 30 years of violence, and it would be appalling to see Northern Ireland go back to that. I think certainly the UK government are playing fast and loose with it in the sense of who they're meeting, how they're meeting, the claims they're making about being able to just get rid of the Northern Ireland Protocol. It was Boris Johnson that went and met with Leo Varadkar and came back, clutching his piece of paper going, I've solved it, and then won the 2019 election on it. I've got a deal, I can get Brexit done. And then when we wanted more time to scrutinise it, to debate it, we were told, oh, we've been debating Brexit for years. You don't need any more time. And now the very same people are going, oh, we didn't realise it would mean that. We had the Prime Minister himself speaking to business people in Northern Ireland saying, oh, there won't be any paper, there won't be any checks, phone me up if they give you hassle. I mean, they've literally lied to people in Northern Ireland, having not actually paid Northern Ireland any heed back in 2016 at the time of the referendum, and to think, well, what would this mean? And at the moment, David Frost had made the claim, oh, we'll have sorted it by the 12th of July. Why would you pick that date? A date of kind of tension and friction within the province as it is. Why would you set up that date to have everything sorted when you know you're not going to be able to do it? And certainly what we see in Europe is trust in the UK government just completely evaporating. There is now the feeling in the EU that Boris Johnson agreed to the Northern Ireland Protocol, won his election, got his majority, is safely in number 10, always with the intention to just keep worrying and picking at it until he pulled it apart to what he wants. But it's a simple fact. The single market is the single market. It is the biggest advantage and strength of the EU, and they have to protect it from lower standard imports. Now, the UK could have said they would align, and then there isn't a danger. But no, we're talking already about a trade deal with Australia, with antibiotic-fed, meat, with hormone-fed meat, with chlorine-washed chicken, whatever. So, suddenly, not only have we, in theory, left that risk to the single market, we're actually charging ahead with something that is a direct threat. So while people say, oh, the worry is an American trade deal, no, the worry is already there with an Australian trade deal. And if the UK is going to diverge and lower its food standards, despite all the promises, then the border checks have to be somewhere. And the vast majority of people in Northern Ireland, on both sides of the constitutional divide, feel it's more practical to have it in the sea than to have it on nearly 300 road crossings on the border.
Yeah. Picking up on what you said about the trade deals, then, obviously there's going to be meat and produce coming in from countries quite far away that are not going to be up to the standards that we would expect here in this country, or that we've become used to expecting. Is it not the case, though, that simply UK food sailors and UK food producers can still continue along the same road that they've been going down for the past 20, 30 years and give people the choice? So people could say, well, I'm going to go and I'm going to buy British, as it were, or buy Scottish, or whatever it was. And therefore, the Australian trade deal doesn't make as much of an impact necessarily on our health and our food standards as perhaps it might have done.
Well, the problem is it will become harder for our farmers to compete. So even before you get to food standards, the sheer scale of intensive, even cattle farming, things. If you look it up on the internet, you'll be shocked at the photographs you're seeing. You
Yeah.
will never have seen a beef farm that looked like that. So very intensive cattle farming, which makes it, of course, much cheaper, and therefore they can undercut our farmers. Now, while Scotch beef is a high quality premium product, our farmers also have to compete in the general beef market for, making mince, etc. And the problem is our kind of farming, high quality, grass-fed cattle, etc., isn't going to be able to compete in quantity and cheapness. And it won't necessarily be that you'll have a choice. The UK government is taking control over food labelling, so they may simply stop telling you what the source is, or they may come up with a rule where, if the beef has been in the UK for 24 hours, suddenly it's British beef. But more
Right.
hidden than that is these kind of meats will be in takeaway, they will be in fast food, they will be in restaurants, they will be in ready meals, they could be in schools and hospitals. So you won't know, and you won't therefore have a choice.
Yeah. Pretty scary stuff. Um, Theresa May, of course, was kind of caught between a rock and a hard place, wasn't she? Because she didn't support Brexit, but she became prime minister with a government that very much did support Brexit, and an opposition, many of whom were from constituencies that supported Brexit. What could she have done differently in the last few years in order to create a deal that wasn't as bad as this?
Well, I think, if you actually look at Theresa May's involvement during the campaign, she wasn't terribly involved. And I remember when it was very much talked about, it'll be Boris Johnson versus George Osborne. And I remember saying, I think Theresa May will come through the middle. Because although she was technically on the side of Remain, she hadn't really campaigned very hard, and she was clearly willing to switch and support Brexit and take it forward. I think the key thing she could have done would be consult. Say, it was a 52-48 vote. We had two nations that voted for Brexit, two that voted against it. On the side of Brexit was the biggest nation, so population-wise. But if you're talking all that rot that we had in 2014 about being equal partners in a family of nations, I mean, all of that kind of stuff went out the window. Whereas she could have consulted, she could have allowed people to come together to think, okay, what is the least worst Brexit? And obviously that was something that the Scottish Government put on the table, in the sense of, okay, if we leave the political union, in what way can we stay in the single market and stay in the customs union, or as closely aligned to the customs union as possible? So, either for the whole UK, and therefore decreasing the damage that we're seeing at the moment, or at the very least for the two nations that voted Remain. Obviously, Northern Ireland has something like that, and while it's causing an awful lot of friction, GB to NI, and there's no question about that, what you have seen is cross-border trade between the Republic and the north of Ireland has increased massively. So, we look at Northern Ireland and actually we see the other way around. We see the advantages they have. Their fishermen land catch, and it's in essence straight into the single market. If you had someone opening a new manufacturing facility in aerospace, which is big in my constituency, and they're looking at Ayrshire or Northern Ireland, well, one of them, in essence, has the right to be considered in the single market. So, the danger for us here on the west coast of Scotland is that Northern Ireland does actually have advantages in its access to the single market that we don't have. At the moment, it obviously has a huge amount of friction in the normal supply routes it has from GB. But that may change. So I would imagine people in Northern Ireland, the products they source, etc., will be gradually switching, and they will source more things from the Republic and from the EU through the Republic.
Yeah. Moving on to where we are now, then, it looks as though the predictions about food shortages are about to become a reality. That's because of lorry drivers who were EU citizens who are now having to leave the country, and of course, a similar situation may be about to happen to our NHS as well. You have plenty of experience of working within the NHS. How do you think that the hostile environment policies and all this talk about getting the settled status sorted within the next 28 days, how do you think that that's going to impact on our NHS and our other vital services here in Scotland and across the UK?
Well, the four NHSs across the UK, and particularly then the social care sector, have significant EU staff within them. Now, there will be some people who've gone back to Europe, maybe because of COVID, and then haven't bothered coming back because of the hostile environment, or they had already left. But regardless of that, what we certainly see is a reduction in kind of people in key professions coming. The number of EU nurses registering to come and work in the UK dropped by almost 90%. I mean, literally, it went off a cliff. And that happened within a few months of the referendum itself. So before there was going to be any technical difficulty in coming, but the message went out, in essence, you're not welcome here. You're foreigners. We don't want you in the UK. Now, I was never prouder of our First Minister than on the morning after the referendum when she spoke to EU citizens here, people like my husband, saying, we want you to stay. You are our friends, our family. You're part of our community. Don't go. But the problem is there's over 330,000 applications for EU settled status still pending. Over 40% of people are not getting settled status. They're getting what's called pre-settled status, which is much less secure. And you have to remember to apply for settled status after 5 years. And you won't be notified. You're going to have to kind of keep transferring it to your calendar and make sure you apply. But you don't have the same rights as settled status. And that group, and people who've had to go through multiple applications to achieve it, includes people who've been here for decades. The government keep talking as if, pre-settled status is for people who've only been here 2 years. I've had people who've struggled who've been here for 25, 30 years. And we still will have many groups, particularly vulnerable groups, who will get caught out by this. Very elderly people who came here after the war, who then, Europe developed, the EU was there, they didn't need to become citizens, but they're now quite elderly. They may even have early dementia. They're not even thinking that all of this applies to them.
Yeah.
And people with kind of variations of permanent residency who are also expected to apply. But if you've got something that says permanent on it, you kind of think it means permanent. And the other one is children. So children whose parents haven't applied on their behalf, or children in care. Some of these groups, it could be in 10 years' time when they apply to university or, go looking for a job. And all of a sudden, actually, it turns out, like Windrush, many years later, oh no, your parents who aren't alive anymore should have done X, Y, and Z, and therefore you don't have status. So to me, things like that, there are so many people who could get caught out. And one of the simple things that the EU citizens absolutely object to is the lack of physical proof. There's no ID card, there's nothing in your passport. You cannot physically prove that you have got settled status. You have to go in and do it digitally. Well, there's many people who don't have a smartphone. There's many people who might be in an area where they don't have good internet, or they're applying to rent a flat or get a job. And frankly, the landlord or the employer just can't be bothered. So they just kind of go, no, well, I'm not going to bother with you because I'd have to wade through all of this stuff to find what your status is. So I'm just going to take this person over here instead. And people are reporting that kind of thing already. And we see it affecting, obviously, workforce in the NHS. We've already got workforce challenges. We've seen it, as you've mentioned, with hauliers. We see it with, farm workers and so on, that it's so much harder, so much more expensive to come, and people feel unwelcome. And it's not as if this is the only place they could come to work. There's 31 countries that actually they can go to without any paperwork. So why not do that? And the problem is, even European drivers working for European countries are less keen to come here. They can only drop off at 2 places, deliver 2 loads. But they're then afraid that they'll get snarled up with paperwork or problems on the way back. So, we've seen that on top of everything fishing faced in getting seafood out back in January and February. Local fishermen have reported to me that, they're suddenly told, we've no drivers, we can't get your load out. And of course, something like seafood, it can't wait. If it's not there when it's fresh, then it's going to get destroyed. So we are seeing all of this damage. And to be honest, I'm on Hilary Benn's Trade and Business Commission, and we're looking at the small print that is spinning out. So on Thursday, we were hearing from the creative industries, and they have the same issue with haulage. Yeah. A British haulier, maybe a tour specialist, can no longer go with a band on a tour of Europe because they can only do 2 drop-offs. So in actual fact, they have to take all of their equipment, say, to their first stop in the Netherlands or Paris, and then they have to hire an EU company to do the rest. So, we're actually losing business. And for every person, every roadie, every actor, every singer in this tour, you have to get a visa and a work permit for every single country you're going to visit. I have always said freedom of movement was the biggest single benefit to all of us as individuals, and the things that came from it, like our health insurance card. Unless you're running a business, freedom of movement was the biggest benefit. And for Scotland, where we need more people, the loss of freedom of movement is actually the biggest problem for us.
Yeah, that's a very good point, is that it doesn't even just affect our food and our NHS. I mean, it affects everyone in every area of life and every business. Yeah, it's some pretty scary stuff that we're talking about here, I have to say. It really is. What is it that Scotland can do?
We should have been having this debate, Scott, before the referendum.
Yeah.
But, with a campaign of 6 weeks and, literally the debate being scaremongering on one side and a bus on the other. This kind of thing just wasn't looked at all.
Yeah. What is it then that Scotland and the Scottish government can do? Because there's been numerous proposals put forward about what people can do in order to stop folk turning up at their door, essentially, to kick them out. We've seen what happened at Kenmure Street, the people of Glasgow turning up physically to stop the vans removing people. The Scottish Greens, in their conference in 2020, suggested that in their autumn conference had an emergency motion where they said that the Scottish government should provide some sort of physical token to those who are EU 27 migrants. Would that have made any difference if they had some sort of proof from the Scottish government? Would the Home Office still just came along and went, no, you're out anyway?
Absolutely. The Home Office has no respect for the Scottish government, and Border Force or the Immigration Service are under the control of the Home Office. So that wouldn't protect them. I mean, obviously, you can mount campaigns, as we saw happen spontaneously in Kenmure Street, providing someone can tell you that something's going to happen. But what we've already seen, and this is probably what we will see more than people being deported, is actually the kind of action on the border. I mean, literally the fact that detentions and returns surged by multiples to 3,500 in the first quarter of the year. So, that included young people who were coming here for a job interview. On the government website, it said that was covered by just, normal holiday travel. And then suddenly they were arrested by Border Force. They were either put straight on a plane back home, or some of them were put in detention centers. Some of them even prisons were used. I mean, can you imagine their extended family when they go back home, what the view of the UK and the hostile environment is? And I think what we are seeing in Europe is a growing recognition that, Scotland is being dragged out of Europe by the throat. We do not want this. We do not believe in this. We consider ourselves a small, modern European country. And our aim is to return to the EU. And the only way we can do that is by becoming independent and having control of our own future. At the moment, we're locked in the boot of Boris Johnson's car. And, people have to recognize you then have no control of any kind, where he's taking us now and where he'll take us next. And what we also see is actually the powers of our parliament being undermined. We see devolution rolled back. So even those who don't support independence but support devolution need to wake up and realise what the UK Internal Market Bill, or Market Act as it is now, has the potential to do to our NHS, to our procurement, to our environmental law, to our food standards. And that really, I mean, I see Scotland is very much under threat by this government.
Yeah. So the Scottish government has a mandate, actually, probably about 3 or 4 mandates now for a second independence referendum. I'm going to have to ask you, when do you think that referendum might take place?
Well, I'm not sure that we can quite say 3 or 4 mandates. We did have a referendum in 2014 and sadly we lost. And, my kind of tear-stained face was evidence of that. In 2015, we would have had no basis and we didn't fight the campaign on independence. In 2016, we did get a mandate in that we said if the situation changed. But the mandate that we got last month is absolutely clear.
Yeah.
That the people, the majority of MSPs in our parliament want an independence referendum. Frankly, I want it as soon as possible, but we have to get through the acute COVID crisis. We saw the support for independence rise last year as people respected the First Minister, how serious she was, how honest and open she was in the briefings with the people of Scotland, and particularly in comparison to the absolute chaos that we saw in Downing Street. And that is what will win over people who are not yet convinced. I get a bit tired of the, hashtag impatient for Indy. I'm impatient for Indy. But it's not about us. We already believe in independence. Our job is to speak to people who don't yet believe in independence and convince them share information with them, whether they're neighbours or friends or work colleagues, or whether we're part of actual, campaign action, is we should be convincing others instead of attacking either the First Minister or MPs like me going, oh, well, you're just too comfy
Yeah.
in Westminster. Westminster's not a comfy place for any of us, believe me. So, I mean, I would hope that we might get there next year. I would like it as soon as possible next year if we can get out the other side of the acute COVID crisis. I do not think that we have to wait for the COVID recovery, like people like Anna Sarwar say,
Yeah.
because what power do we have to build a recovery? The people in Scotland want a well-being recovery. They want
Yes.
a Scotland that's fairer and greener for everyone. We don't have the power to do that. And that is the clear blue water between us and the Tories, between independents and being stuck in the union. We see from the behaviour, the kind of elites, the handing out contracts to pals, that everything is going to go back to business as usual. The Chancellor's already talking about, stopping furlough in September, cutting universal credit in September. We're facing another decade of Tory austerity. It didn't work the first time. It won't work this time, but there will be a lot of casualties along the way. That isn't what we want. And therefore, we need those powers to rebuild a Scotland that is about well-being and about the well-being of every single person who lives here. So my answer to people like our supporters is as soon as possible, but we don't want to be putting off people by suddenly saying, oh, COVID doesn't matter. We're going to be out marching or knocking doors or having big public meetings. That would be nonsense. So we have to get through the acute crisis. And for those who in the Labour Party and the Lib Dems and so on, who say, oh no, it should all be about the COVID recovery. Well, you show me the tools we've got to build a fairer economy. You show me the tools for us to actually stop child poverty. Poverty is the biggest driver of ill health in the UK, and the Tories at Westminster are the biggest drivers of poverty. So unless we can get away from that, we can't build the better Scotland that we're all visualising after COVID.
Yeah, of course, people talk about after the recovery, but before the pandemic, we still hadn't really fully recovered from the crash of 2008, had we? So, I mean, we're in a situation where it's going to take an awful long time, and without the powers, as you say, that independence bring, what can we do about that?
Yeah, well, I mean, absolutely. Austerity was a total mistake. If you take money out of the economy by cutting benefits and freezing public sector pay, it might look good on the balance sheets at Westminster, but all your local economies are dying because people don't have money to spend. So shops shut, businesses shut down or cut back in their employees, and actually your economy is spiraling down. You want to inject money at the bottom of the economic pyramid. And that doesn't just help the people there, but it actually stimulates the economy. Money all ends up either back in the hands of government or in the hands of the rich in the end anyway. But if you put the money at the bottom, it spirals its way up. If you put the money at the top through tax breaks and things, it just ends up in an offshore bank doing nothing. And
Yes.
that's what we saw over the last 10 years. And from the language of Sunak, that's what we're going to have again. So to me, it is urgent to get out. And it's urgent to get those powers so that we build back from COVID to be somewhere where we're literally thinking about the holistic well-being of every citizen, their physical and mental health, their social and economic and environmental well-being, so that we end up with a greener and fairer country. And to me, that's the vision that most people want. They don't want to go back to business as usual. They want to go forward to where we all know we need to be by 2030, or we're going to burn the planet. Well, changing a speeding train is a real challenge. But what COVID did is it brought everything to a shuddering halt. And it won't just bounce back. We will need to invest time, energy, and money to rebuild. Well, that means we've got a choice about what we rebuild and how we rebuild it, but only if we have the powers to do it. So all the people saying, oh no, you have to wait till after the recovery. Well, we saw how poor the UK's recovery was, as you say, from the crash because of the decision about Tory austerity. And they're going to do exactly the same again. And that's not what Scotland wants. I mean, in 2014, I campaigned for independence because I thought Scotland could be better than it was. Now I would campaign with every ounce of energy I have, because I think if we don't become independent, Scotland is going to become much worse.
Yeah. A lot of the things that you highlighted there with the poverty and wealth gap in the country are things that a lot of critics of the SNP on the left have been critical of the SNP about. Is this something that we need independence for in order to get things like a universal basic income, for example? Do we need independence for that, or can that be done before independence?
No,
Similarly
it
with a
can't.
public sector.
No, it
Yeah.
can't. It simply can't. I mean, the Scottish Government were supportive of having pilot projects, and we're planning to work with 4 local governments, but the DWP wouldn't cooperate.
Mm.
So, even at the moment, in trying to develop the kind of various benefits in Scotland, they're trying to dance with an elephant on their back. If you're actually developing something from a blank sheet of paper from the ground up and you can control the shape of it, is one thing. If everything is an argument with someone else, which is what happens, then you just can't get anything done. I don't think people recognize how much energy Scotland wastes fighting for every little pick of devolution, or now trying to fight to protect and hang on to every little scrap of devolution. That energy could actually be going into new policies, into decision making. And if you had a simpler tax system that was fairer, you wouldn't have all the loopholes. It's the absolute quagmire of the UK tax system that allows all of these people to not pay their taxes. So, things like that, something that's simpler to collect, to design, and therefore harder to evade. There's all of these things that you could do that would be fairer, but you can only do them if you can control your entire tax system and if you can control your economy. And that
Yeah.
people have seen that the 2 things we didn't get to control in this pandemic was we didn't have control of our borders and we didn't have control of the purse. And that meant we couldn't lock down unless Westminster was agreeing to lockdown, and we couldn't shut our borders and stop planes coming here if we wanted to. And those 2 things were massive, both in September when the Kent variant emerged and also in letting in the Delta variant from India. So if you've got control of your country, then you've got control of your future. Where we are now, we are in a very negative, coercive relationship with Westminster, and it is incredibly negative and incredibly anti-Scottish, and I don't see it improving in any way at all.
Yeah. What would you say to those for whom the reason that they might be reticent about Scottish independence is because they've seen what has happened with Brexit and thought, well, if that's how hard it is to leave a union that we've been in for, 40, 50 years, how hard is it going to be to leave the UK, which we've been in for 300 years and with which most of our trade is? Do you think that that's a legitimate argument? And also, how long would it take before Scotland potentially returns to the EU post-independence?
Well, I think on the latter part, we're seeing more and more support, certainly among the public. Obviously, that big poll, 6,000 people across some of the major nations in the EU, and
Yeah.
over 80% saying Scotland should be allowed in quickly. With regards leaving the Union, Brexit was the first route out of a trade deal, out of a kind of trade bloc that there's ever been. 34 countries, new independent countries, have come into being since 1990. That is a well-trodden path, and that's what Scotland would follow. It'll still be hard work. There's no independence fairy that makes everything okay. But suddenly, if we're in control, we have the power to roll up our sleeves and get to work and build the better Scotland that we all talk about. And I think that would be something that people found inspiring.
Yeah. Is it fair to say that Brexit, sorry, just on our very last point there, is it fair to say that Brexit is perhaps a product of nationalism? And what is it that makes Scottish nationalism distinct and different from that form of British nationalism that led to Brexit?
Well, I think the British nationalism of Brexit is about excluding the other. And I remember being quite shocked when I went to Westminster at how strong the politics of other was, blaming the poor, dismissing the disabled, talking about foreigners. Ours is not. It is inclusive. We welcome people. We want people to come here. We want people to be active members of our society and our communities. And I think those are just poles apart.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Philippa Whitford, for that this evening. I have been Scott Bevan, and I will join you again on Sunday for the Full Scottish. Apologies, not on Sunday. I will be there on Monday. The Full Scottish will be on Sunday. It won't be myself that's there on Sunday, but I'll be with you on Monday. So thank you very much for joining us this evening, and good night.